Welcome everybody to the 6 psychological tricks that make learning stick. My name is Sebastian Bailey. I'm president of Mind Gym Inc. And I'm a psychologist by background and training. And my particular speciality is looking at ways in which you can create a sustained change to people's behaviors within organizations. And the reason for the fact that this is an important topic is that when you look at typical transfer rates from the average intervention, so the numbers of people who go on to apply their learning, often the estimates, when you ask people, around about 15 to 20% of people go on to make a sustained change. Normally what people say is that about 70% of people go on to try their new skill or capability out, but quite quickly backslide into old habits. So what we really mean here is there's a huge amount of unrealized value. When you consider the amount that's spent nationally or globally on education, on learning and development, we're missing an enormous opportunity to really make a difference and increase the value that we provide to our organizations, to our communities, and so on. Now at Mind Gym, we really believe in evidence-based practice. One of our core beliefs is science is sexy, in research we trust. And so what we've done and what's informed this particular webinar is lots of evidence that we've gathered both from the literature but also from our practice in terms of what's worked with other clients. And I'd like to share with you some of these ideas today. And we're going to explore this through 6 specific, interesting questions. So we're going to share a particular question and then explain the principle and then also talk about how you can apply it in practice. And of course, if you'd like to interact with me, if you'd like to send me questions, do please follow me on Twitter at Dr. Seb Bailey. Use the hashtag MindGym, and I'll do everything I can to respond. So, what's our first question that helps us think about how you can make learning stick? And actually, what we're going to start with is perhaps one of the most entrenched habits that people can have is about how do you increase the quit rate of smokers. It's perhaps one of the hardest habits to change. Now, of course, there's plenty of learning opportunities for people who smoke in terms of understanding what the impact of smoking is. We see it on cigarette packets. We see it in health education. The damage that smoking does is in many respects pervasive in terms of the way we're educated. And yet there are many, many people who really struggle to actually make the shift and sustain becoming a non-smoker. Now, this was what was being investigated by someone called James Prochaska, who did, again, a big review of the literature and developed a trans-theoretical approach, he called it, which looked at a number of different stages that people go through as they shift from an old habit to a new habit. And here are some of these stages. Initially, what people do is they persist with an old habit, like I enjoy smoking, and they stay in that habit potentially for years, until it gets to the point where they start contemplating a change. They say, maybe I should give up. Maybe I should change what I do right now. What then happens is people move into a preparing stage where they say, I'm definitely going to quit and I know how. They're starting to get a sense of what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And then they move into an acting stage where they really make the change. I've quit. It's hard, but I've quit. And then what follows that is a maintenance stage. You know, I've not smoked for more than 6 months. What he found was that broadly, people who go through these steps. But when he did his research, he pulled all the data set together, and actually there weren't that many patterns. He was very disappointed that the insights were a little bit weak. There weren't stronger patterns in terms of people making the shift. And then he had a sudden insight, he had a sudden realization that perhaps what he should do is only look at the positive deviance. The psychologists sometimes call it positive deviance, the people who have successfully made a change, the self-changers who have actually managed to maintain the change. And that's where he really made a couple of interesting discoveries. And this was the key one. What you can see here is on the x-axis, you can see the different stages of change. So you've got persisting, contemplating, preparing, acting, and maintaining. And on the y-axis, you've got T-scores. And those are essentially how strongly an individual sort of rated a particular point of view. The purple line with the boxes is actually how people felt about the pros of making a change to their behavior, the pros of, in this instance, quitting smoking. and the pink line with the triangles is the cons. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can actually see right at the beginning, at the persisting stage, perhaps slightly unsurprisingly, the pros of quitting were less than the cons of quitting. So basically, people were persisting with an old behavior. They didn't want to change their habit. But there's a very, very significant thing that happens in between this persisting stage and the contemplating stage, and that's where the pros of quitting, the pros of making the change in behavior, actually start to outweigh the cons. Now, for those of us who've ever tried to change a habit as a New Year's resolution, what often happens there, and one of the reasons why we fail to make those shifts, is that we move very quickly from a persisting state on December the 31st to acting and trying to quit almost immediately on the 1st of January. Now, of course, what's happening here is that we still feel in our heart of hearts the cons of making the shift, of changing our behavior, are greater than the pros of changing the behavior, and so, of course, we happen to fail. And that's what he observed between those people who genuinely managed to change their behavior in a sustained way and those that didn't. There was this crucial stage between persisting and contemplating where the pros and cons shifted. And he then started to review this in a whole series of other activities. And he found that this pattern existed whether or not you were looking at habits of starting to use sunscreen or exercising more or even weight control. He even looked at the number, one of his fellow researchers even looked at how long you could stick with doing sit-ups on a daily basis. And there were some really clear themes. At the persisting stage, the cons of changing outweigh the pros, and at the acting stage, the pros of changing outweigh the cons. So there's this really, really significant shift that happens between those two stages. And when I think about what organizations do, a little bit like that New Year's Eve effect, we rush people, whether it be learning, whether or not it be change management, but we rush people from a persisting stage of operating into an acting stage of operating. And then we're surprised the fact that people actually haven't made a sustained change to their behavior. And part of it is because we haven't taken them through a contemplating or even a preparing or a planning stage where they really have an opportunity to understand what the benefits are to them of actually making a shift in behavior. So how do we apply this trick? The first thing, and I think this is a really, really crucial point, is that we need to think habit change as much as learning. And we do need to recognize the stages of change and how important that upfront engagement is. The second thing is we've got to be careful not to rush people from persisting to acting and expect much change. That early stages are crucial. And then finally, encouraging belief in the value of the change is actually as important as building the capability for change itself. Because if people believe that the value of change is there, then they will self-serve. They will seek out opportunities to learn. They will seek out opportunities to transfer their learning. And it can be an extraordinarily powerful way of making that change stick and making the learning stick. So that's our first trick. Let's move on to our second question. And that is, how do you get a group of know-it-all MBA graduates to do as they're told? And actually, this was a question that a client of mine approached and said that what they were doing is that they were hiring some of the smartest MBA graduates in the world. And actually, this was a consultancy, global consultancy, well-known, well-recognized. And what they were finding was that these MBA students would be arriving and they'd be causing some level of havoc. Now, the thing about consultancies, particularly if you want to sort of scale them up, is that you really need a consistent approach. You need consistent language, consistent tools, consistent methodology, because teams can form very quickly. You want people approaching the problem and talking about how they solve the problem in really quite unified terms. And you can still have some form of innovation around the edges, but that unification of approach is crucial to get to speed to value and to deliver good consultancy engagements. Now, what was happening was the MBA students or the graduates, forgive me, the MBA graduates were arriving and they'd spent a lot of money on their education. They felt that they knew an awful lot and they'd been equipped with some of the best and the brightest professors with different tools, and they were turning up and starting to say, well, how about we do it differently, or how about we could do this instead? And what that had led to was inconsistency and actually greater levels of conflict and slower deliverables than the consultancy wanted. Now, question was, how do we get this to change? How do we make a difference here? And the client very, very intelligently said, we need to overhaul, we need to rethink our onboarding. And this is what they did. They took, as part of the onboarding for the MBA grads, them into the middle of nowhere, no cell reception, miles away from home, outside of their normal social support sort of systems. And when people arrived, they greeted each other, and then they got stuck into a simulation really quite quickly. And what they did was the guy who was fabulous at financial modeling, they gave her the client handling task. The person who was really good at planning, they gave her the modeling task. The person who was traditionally quite good with clients, they gave him the planning task. And so different people were assigned to activities that didn't naturally play to their strengths. And then they ran the simulation. And of course, what happened? There was conflict, there was tension, there was a failure to deliver to results on time, and overall the individuals just didn't succeed in the way they were expecting to. At that point, they then started to introduce the consultancy's tools and the consultancy's approach and the consultancy's way of operating. Lots of cautionary tales, lots of examples of real engagements, and started to educate the MBA graduates about the right approach. What they then did towards the end of the onboarding was they reran the simulation. And this time, they really assigned people to play to their strengths rather than necessarily their weaknesses. And of course, it was an enormous success using the methodology and the language and the tools that the consultancy needed them to use. And of course, at that point, the MBA grads left the onboarding committed to using the language, to using the tools, to using the methodology, and then they were able to go out and deliver good quality engagements quickly. So that's what happened. It's an example in practice about how you make it work. But what's happening? What's the underlying psychology that sits here? And this is all about harnessing positive stress. And actually, this is not a new idea. This is something that was developed by two psychologists called Yerkes and Dodson in the 1920s, I believe. And you can tell it's a slightly older model because of the language that they've used. But we wanted to be true to their framework. On the x-axis over here, they've marked this up as arousal, and what you can see is the sort of levels of low arousal at this end and high arousal at that end. And over here, you've got performance with weaker or poor performance and strong performance at the top end. Now, what happens, of course, is when people have got low levels of arousal, their performance tends to be slightly weaker. You know, that they're bored, they're sort of apathetic, they're not necessarily fully committed or fully engrossed in what they're doing because they're just not that interested. Now, what happens is if you increase arousal, you tend to get to optimal performance. So there comes a point at which you're sort of at a level of excitement or anxiety or just sort of general engagement that you reach really much stronger levels of performance. But if you push that arousal too far, of course your performance suffers. And that may very well be because of strong anxiety. So that's you know, we've had a practical example, we've had a sort of a theoretical model. Let's look at an experimental, at a test. And this was done, really important topic, about how you can actually get people to go and become vaccinated, particularly for things like measles or mumps or rubella and other diseases. What will drive people to volunteer to take a vaccine, which of course is slightly painful. And what the experimenters wanted to have a look at was how people rated, based upon slightly different messages, the importance of getting some shots. And they had two conditions. And in the first condition, it was a recommend only. So, we recommend that you and your time of life, this is done with college students, at your time of life, get these sorts of shots to protect you from disease. And in the recommend only condition, people were then asked to rate how important they felt getting a shot was on a 14-point scale, and they scored it at 8.7. Now, they then had a fear condition, and with messages that were much more fear-oriented, the subjects felt, the participants felt, that the importance of shots actually went up to 11.9 out of 13. So you can see that in the fear condition with those fear messages, developing that sense of anxiety, people started to believe that shots were more important. They then also asked some questions about, do you intend to get some shots as well? And this is what they discovered, that in the recommend only condition, it was around about 7 out of 13, but in the fear condition, it was 11.3 out of 13. So you can see here that in the fear condition, the intention to actually get the shots went up as well. Now, I think this is very much like reaction sheets at the end of learning and development sessions. You know, we ask people, is this your intention to apply? Will you go on to make a change? And what we're saying here is that actually that is a useful bit of data, but really what matters is whether or not people have actually gone on to make the change. And to discover what numbers of people went on to make a change, we're going to have a look at that right now. In the control condition, or alternatively the fear alone condition, only 3.3% of people went on to actively go and get their shots. And what they hypothesized here was that the traditional sort of recommend-only approach, you know, wasn't very likely to transfer because people didn't really see it as being important, and they actually said that there was a lower intention to apply. What they found with the fear alone condition was that it was potentially sending people into a state of anxiety. People actually got so worried about it that they got paralyzed into doing nothing. So what they added to it was then a condition where there were fear and very explicit steps of what they needed to do. And the explicit steps here was very simply incorporating a map with directions of how you can actually get to the medical center to get the shots done. And that shifted the percentage of people who went and got their shots to 33%. So really, and you might say, well, that's nothing like 100%, but it's 1,000% improvement over a traditional approach where you're simply making a recommendation or alternatively going for a fear-based approach. So what can we learn from this as learning and development and change professionals? Really, the first thing is that we can schedule the learning just before or just after a challenging experience. That sense of arousal and anxiety that we get from that is very likely then for us to proactively seek out opportunities to solve problems. It's one of the main benefits of just-in-time learning. The other aspect is about selling the need and the personal consequence of not developing. It's not enough just to have a burning platform, but people need to understand the personal consequence of this and also the very specific call to action and the steps that they need to deliver to solve the problem. It needs to be clear, it needs to be explicit. So you don't send people into sort of almost paralyzing anxiety, but actually a level of change that they feel capable of solving a problem. You create and sell the problem and you show the solution. And again, when I reflect on the way in which learning and development or change is very frequently done in organizations, these key activities around the personal benefits and the personal sort of negative consequences of not taking action, and then the route to solving that problem is often left as the rush to focusing on events and capability building becomes a key focus. Okay, so let's move on to our next curious question. How do you get people to donate more money to a charity? So having learned about a particular charity, what actually makes the difference in terms of getting people to take action, to specifically go and donate cash? And this was an experiment that was done with Save the Children, who are a wonderful charity that really focus on children that are suffering from poverty or infirmity all over the world. Now, what the experimenters did here was they invited people to come and actually listen to pitches about Save the Children, and it was done on a campus, and people were going to be paid $5 to come and take part in this particular study. What they did was they split people who came to the experiment into two conditions. The first condition were given a very factual, data-based, still compelling from a data perspective pitch. So they learned about percentages, they learned about the numbers of people numbers of children who were suffering, and how much donations would make a difference to them, and so forth. Then what they did was they compared that with a very, very specific story around a single individual. And then, of course, what they did was they asked people to provide feedback. Now, the real kicker here, and this is not what the participants were expecting, was at the end of listening to the two pitches, one or other of the pitches, they were asked to donate to whether or not they would like to donate any of the $5 they had just earned by listening to the pitches to the charity. And the variable that the experimenters were focused on was how much money will these two different groups donate. And therefore, which of these methods is leading to greater levels of activity. Arguably, which of these two approaches is leading to greater levels of transfer, of really actually making people get on and apply their learning as opposed just to talking about the intention of applying. And this is what they found. In the stats condition, it was $1.43 or $1.43, just under $1.50. And in the story condition, very specific story about an individual who was suffering, a child who was suffering, it went up quite significantly to $2.38. So we can see here that the story has much greater sort of emotional resonance. It makes us empathize with a particular situation, and as a result of that, increases the likelihood of us both transferring our behavior in a sustained way. Now, many people, when I share this experiment with them, say, well, how come more people didn't donate $5 or $10 or more than that? And again, remember, we're dealing with students, and they probably needed to buy their ramen noodles at the end of the day and pay for dinner, and that's why perhaps it was a little bit less than the $5 expected. But the point being is that we can see that in terms of action and activity, the story condition was more powerful than the stats condition. Now, in another test that was done by Dan Heath, it wasn't specifically an experiment, but it was more a sort of reported test that he did. He got people to listen to pitches that contained both stats and stories, and what he found was, sometime later, he asked people to recall the stats or the stories, what they recalled, and he found that 5 in 10 people actually remembered a statistic. So the recall of the stats was actually quite weak. But this is where it gets interesting. 63% of people remembered a story. And so again, as well as actually shifting the sort of strengths of behavior, we've also got much, much more memorable items when we tell stories as opposed to when we use statistics. And again, when I reflect on what we tend to do in organizations, particularly with learning, is we tend to pack our learning with stats, and we tell far fewer stories. Now, of course, and subject matter experts actually encourage us to put in more stats, and we worry about skeptics, and therefore we put more stats in. But actually, it's in many respects, it's personal stories that are going to resonate with participants that are much more likely to be recalled and much more likely then to lead to transfer and sustained transfer at that. And I quite frequently meet people who say, well, how do I, what do I need to do to persuade the subject matter experts to change their approach and be a little bit more reasonable about the content that gets placed into experiences? I think demonstrates, tell stories of what you think is likely to deliver the value, what's likely to create that sense of resonance and make it stickier. Now, one of my wonderful colleagues at MindGym is full of wonderful people, and in particular wonderful psychologists, and one of them recently shared this study with me, and I thought I'd share it with you, which actually looked at what people deem to be accurate. And it's quirky because what they tested, what these two psychologists tested, was whether or not people deem rhyming statements more accurate than non-rhyming statements. So in this instance, we've got an aphorism like woes unite foes, or birds of a feather flock together. And people asked to rate how accurately they felt those particular statements were. What they found was that on a scale of 7, most people said those rhyming statements scored over 6. They're pretty accurate on the whole. What they then did was they then shifted the same aphorisms, the same sort of statements, but they removed the rhyme. So it became things like woes unite enemies, or birds of a feather flock conjointly. And they wanted to test whether or not there was accuracy there. And what we see is that actually the accuracy rate dropped. Now, people weren't aware of this with these modified items. But what they found was when things stopped rhyming, it actually people saw the statement as being less accurate. Two interesting things about this. The first one is the fact that people were unaware of it, but when they were told about it, the accuracy rating dropped. So as soon as they became aware of this, they kind of sussed it out, and they adjusted how accurate they thought the original rhyming statements were. The second really key point is the fact that the psychologists said, well, we think that what's underlying this is the fact that because rhyming statements are easier to process, easier to understand, because they're more verbally fluent, it actually requires less energy to process it. It requires less cognitive load to think this through. And therefore, we see it as being more accurate. And this is fascinating because what it means is if we can actually reduce the amount of energy, of cognitive energy, amount of effort that people have to make in terms of thinking, they're much more likely to do things in a particular way, much more likely to apply their learning, much more likely to make it stick. So, rhyming makes a difference, and given that, don't just tell, use stories that sell, because stats and number will cause slumber, while rhyme and emotion will win devotion. So let us move on to our next question. And that is, how do you get job seekers to improve their resume? So what we have here is individuals who've been through some education on how to improve the quality of their resume. Of course, it's an important topic because the more people who can then get into jobs, it improves economic activity, reduces unemployment, makes the job market more fluid. So it's an important topic. And the interesting question was, and this was studied by someone called Peter Gollwitzer, was what can we do to get people, having learned about how to improve the quality of their resume, to then actually go on and make the change. And this is what happened, this is what he discovered. The first condition, he got people in different groups, and he asked people to commit to completing the update of the resume, which is known as a goal intention. So for example, you might say something like, I will update my resume by the 23rd of June. He then got people into other groups, and he got them very specifically to think in advance about where, when, and how they were going to get started with the task of improving their resume. And this is known as an implementation intention as opposed to a goal intention. So it's very specifically focused on getting people to think about where and how they're going to implement something as opposed to simply what they're going to achieve. What he found was only 20% of the participants who'd committed to updating their resume did so in the goal intention condition. Now, for me, this is crucial because I've always been slightly suspicious about action planning. You know, it's something you kind of put on at the end, and people write broad, slightly, even if you say, develop SMART goals, they develop broadly, rough ideas of when they think they want to achieve a particular goal, and they leave the experience, and really, I leave it often feeling a little bit unconvinced about whether or not they're really going to transfer their learning. And what Gollwitzer found was that when he used implementation intentions, actually the transfer rate increased dramatically, and 80% of participants who considered where, when, and how they would up their resume did so. So we get this massive increase in transfer because we're actually getting people to think very specifically about the implementation intention as opposed to the goal intention. Now, what he then said was, okay, well, let's take this a stage further. How can we tune the way in which we write the goal intention to really make sure that more people are, that it's as accurate as possible? And we had two conditions again. One was where the intention to perform, one was where people wrote the implementation intention as a way of performing a certain action at a given time and place. So for example, I will do as many math puzzles as possible each Wednesday at 9 a.m. And in the second condition, he got people to add an if-then statement. Okay? And this was to actually create what he called a situational cue, where the situation, the environment, the context that you're in actually triggers a particular behavior, or it triggers a particular thought. And this is what we see here. So in this context, it was people would write things like, if it's Wednesday at 9 a.m., I will do as many math puzzles as possible. And actually, those are the two statements that he used. And what he did was he got people to try and solve these math puzzles using a computer. And what he was able to then track was how far did people deviate from their original implementation intention. So he wasn't measuring the number of math puzzles that was completed. What he was actually measuring was how far or near from the time that individuals had specified were they actually doing it. And this is what he found. He found that in the first condition, where you just have a broader implementation, the participants deviated from their desired time by an average of 8 hours, so quite a significant deviation from their original implementation. But when the situational cue was used, participants only deviated by an hour and a half. So what we can see here is much greater numbers of people actually going in and implementing, if you use an implementation intention instead of a goal intention. And actually, if you use these situational cues, people are much more accurate and more likely to apply it when they said they would. The reason for that, just like the point earlier, if we can make it easier for people, if we can reduce the cognitive load, if we don't have to make them think quite as hard, they're more likely to go in and actually make a change, as opposed to piling on sort of like the cognitive effort in trying to make a change and make the change stick. Now, the other thing I think it's worth mentioning is social support, because there's been a little bit of a debate about, there was a TED talk that slightly misrepresented some research that was done about the use of social support when it comes down to goals. And really what we see is sharing goals does create a feeling of accountability, and that feeling of accountability actually does drive better levels of transfer, particularly if the conversation about the goal is, will you be a support for me? Will you keep me honest? Will you help me do this in the right way? If, however, and this is where you've got to be careful, and this is what the study actually showed, was that in some instances, if you share a goal, it gives people a false sense of progression, and because they feel like it reduced actually the anxiety, they feel like they've already made progress because they've shared it, and as a result of that, less transfer happens. So when you're thinking about setting up implementation intentions, when you're thinking about setting people up to transfer in a sustained way, I would encourage you to get people to share their goals, but I would also encourage you to make it very clear to people that sharing isn't progress. Progress only happens when we actually start to make action on the transfer task, not sharing ideas about the transfer task. So how do we apply this trick? Well, use implementation intentions. Use if-then statements, even better. Sometimes they can be a little bit difficult to formulate, but they're very powerful if you get it right. And then do get people to tell others about their commitment, but don't get them to kid themselves that actually they're making any progress as a result. Okay, our next question, number 5. How do you get drivers to notice bicyclists? And what we're going to do is I'm going to play you a clip. You do need to be able to listen to your computer at this point to actually get the media coming through. So I encourage you, if you've turned your computer volume down, do please turn it back on again. And we're actually going to test your awareness. So do please listen, observe, and watch this particular clip now. Great. So what we have there was a test of how observant you were, and ultimately the question is, did you notice any changes? What I'm going to share with you now is the second half of that clip to see how many changes, and you can actually observe how many changes you actually recognized. So here we go with the clip right now. So that was a great campaign from Transport for London, who were really focused on getting people to spot cyclists, because we so often fail to actually recognize the opportunity, because we get very focused on what we're doing. And it was 21 extraordinary numbers of changes took place there. Everything from the flowers at the front to the coat that the inspector was wearing, even to
the person who had been murdered actually changed character. So extraordinary number of changes, and very frequent. Most people say that they recognize 4, maybe 5 of those changes as opposed to the 21. So what's this got to do with making learning stick? Really, what happens is very frequently people miss these opportunities. They fail to recognize the opportunities to transfer their learning, which stops it from sticking. And this was a study that was done by 2 psychologists called Gick and Hollyoak. And what they did was they provided some people with a tool. They taught them about a particular tool. And then they gave them another context that was slightly different where the tool could be applied. And interestingly, in the no-hint condition, only 20% of people recognized that the tool they had could be applied to this new problem. Okay, so you've got a massive failure in transfer here, because what people didn't spot was the fact the tool worked with that new context and that new environment. What they then did was they then gave people a very small hint about the fact the tool could be used, and the 92% of people then actually suggested what the right solution was. They recognized the fact that that particular tool could be used for that new problem. So what's going on there? It's a giant failure in opportunity recognition. And to make this real, we were asked to work on a coaching program for a client, where the client had actually gone and done some surveys about transfer and about use, and found that many, many people, having understood and learned about coaching, were actually not transferring their skills. And the number one reason they gave was the fact they didn't have time. They didn't actually have time to apply their new skills. Very common. And actually, the issue wasn't about time at all. The issue was about recognizing the opportunities to transfer. So instead what we did was that we shifted it. So actually, have you had a conversation with one of your team members by the water cooler in the last couple of weeks? Yes, there's an opportunity. Has a team member come to you with a problem with a client or a customer? Yes, there's an opportunity. And so by reframing the situations that people were looking for, it massively increased the transfer rates and actually how well things stuck. So use cues and prompts in the real world to focus attention. Think about how you can set specific missions, specific activities in the real world that then drive that transfer, and how you can build it into the workflow. And think about how you can develop participants' mindfulness as part of the experience. How can you help people not just build a particular capability, but also get better at being present and spotting opportunities to apply this sort of learning. Okay, final question. What makes a psychology professor behave like a soccer hooligan? Now, I'm sitting in New York over here, and I have a great privilege of living in New York and enjoy the United States very frequently. And I had to explain to a group who soccer hooligans were, and I said, do you have soccer hooligans over here? And someone, yes, we do. They're called Patriots fans, which I thought was a little bit mean. But the idea is the fact that people who basically act poorly when they go to sports matches or sports games. And this is a photograph of some soccer hooligans. Now, this psychology professor called Ap Dijksterhuis went to a soccer match with another psychology professor, friend of his, and they fell in essentially with the wrong crowd. They were walking through it, and they were surrounded by people who were acting slightly violently, and there was a beer can sitting on the ground, and he walked up to it, and he booted it, he kicked it really hard against a wall, and then very quickly became embarrassed about what he'd just done. And as psychology professors do, he turned to his colleague and said, well, what made me do that? What was going on there? And he got into how you prime and how context can prime people to behave in particular ways. And he went on to do a study of priming, and specifically, can priming change something as fundamental as general knowledge, or arguably even general intelligence? And what he did was he got general knowledge, he got 100 general knowledge questions, and he primed people in 3 different ways. There was a control condition, so no one was primed. He was then primed a group as professors. So what they did is they spent time talking about the characteristics of a professor and what it would be like to be a professor. And then he primed a group as assistants, and then he got them to do this general knowledge quiz. And you would expect, if priming wasn't going to work, everybody to score the same. This is actually what happened. In the no prime condition, people got 44.9% of these general knowledge questions right on average. In the professor condition, there was a 15-point increase in the number of answers that were correct. So for some reason, priming as a professor just allowed people to access better cognitive operations, possibly even better recall of their general knowledge. And in the assistance condition, it went up against the no prime, but not as much as the professors. So this priming effect had a very, very significant impact on the way in which people approached a task. Now what we thought we would do here, bit of fun, was actually try and prime you. So again, you need your computers on and the sound turned up, and I'm going to ask you to listen to this particular clip. Okay, so wonderful. Okay, so wonderful clip from Queen and Freddie Mercury with Another One Bites the Dust. I'm now going to actually play this clip. We're going to play it backwards for you. So now what I want you to do is listen to this and just see if you recognize anything. Great. Okay, now what I'm going to do, hopefully when I ask people what did you hear, they very frequently say absolutely nothing. What are you talking about? I'm now going to prime you. Okay, now I'm about to show you something. I'm not advocating this from any business perspective or anything else, but here's the, or even personally, but here is the prime. It's fun to smoke marijuana. 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 Okay, that's the prime. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to listen to that Freddie Mercury clip backwards once more and just see if you can hear anything different this time. Great. So hopefully many of you, having been primed, could then start to hear the really quite significant difference in what was being said. And that's actually called, that is called, well, it's priming in practice, but the example of playing music backwards is called backmasking. And there's a great website by jeffmilner.com that's got lots of different examples of backmasking. It's pretty much impossible to do on purpose. So lots of people say, oh, there's a there's a funny side to this, or there's something weird going on here. Not really. It's really accidental, and people then use priming as a way of explaining it. So how can we use priming? How can we trigger people's learning in practice? Well, we can use priming to increase the participants' view of themselves as great learners. How can you prime feelings of resilience and reflectiveness and resourcefulness in the learners themselves to help them apply their learning? How can you develop tools to support participants in their problem solving? Tools act as incredible ways of supporting a particular way of operating and priming. So can you create coaching tools? I operate very differently with a hammer in my hand to a pen in my hand. I'm primed for very different things. And so building the use of tools into learning experience is fundamental. And then also, how can you prompt participants to adopt the right thinking frame for the problem at hand? How can they become expert at that particular task? And how can they adopt that as they go forward? So, okay, those are our 6 tricks. Let's think about how this works in terms of a methodology to make learning stick. And this is how MindGym operates it. Initially, we create an engagement campaign that creates interest, anxiety, and perceived relevance. It moves people up that curve. What we then do is have a diagnostic that increases perceived value for the individual, and it creates that optimal arousal. It makes people feel a little bit of anxiety about their personal ability and capability. What we then do is provide people with a toolkit, and this acts as scaffolding for the learning, and it primes the right mindset both for learning but also for the mindset that you want in terms of application and transfer. What we then have typically is an instructor-led session. This could be delivered virtually or face-to-face, and it has a very strong focus on a real-world problem, and we tend to share general principles and context-specific principles that allow for practice, and that allows people to actually see different ways in which they can apply what they've learned. From there, we have a pledge, which is a very specific focus on transfer, and we use relapsation prevention techniques like implementation intentions and creating the right kind of social support and the right kind of social pressure. And then from there we have a mission, which is an application task built into the workflow. And this is actually what solves the problem of opportunity recognition. It also increases the time to apply. So what you've done is you've massively increased the likelihood of people spotting those opportunities, getting very focused on doing things differently. All the way through this, we're doing everything we can to reduce the cognitive load, the amount of effort it takes for someone to apply their learning in a sustained way. And then we create distributed experiences. And we know from all the research that a series of distributed experiences delivers 17% greater performance improvement than a more traditional approach. So we get much, much better levels of transfer and performance improvement as a result. And then finally, we have boosters which act as after-action reviews, which increases accountability, increases resilience, increases momentum, and a coaching toolkit which increases social support and accountability that might, for example, go to the individual's manager. And when we build the learning experience like that, we get much, much better returns in terms of stickiness, in terms of transfer, and commercially, the return on investment is much more significant as well, often double the return on investment over a more traditional approach, because actually you can run this for far reduced cost and you can deliver much greater value, and also, for example, travel and expenses reduces significantly as well. So the 6 tricks: build belief, create that emotional arousal, use stories over facts, use written shared implementation intentions, build specific missions into the workflow, and prime the right mindset by creating the right tools. I've been Sebastian Bailey. Thank you very much for your time over the course of this webinar. Do please follow me at Dr. Seb Bailey on Twitter. We've also got a white paper that deals with these 6 tricks and also the bite-sized methodology that you can download from our website. It's called The Bite-Sized Revolution: How to Make Learning Stick, and it goes into a good deal of these different approaches for really making this work. That's the end of the presentation.